with autism than in neurotypicals, which is basically a term for anyone who doesn't have autism or ADHD. So I looked at my own experience partly, but because I wasn't doing sort of any sort of anthropology research or any of that kind of stuff, I looked mainly at the academic stuff, and then so long as it was peer reviewed and so long as it was sort of published, and if it chimed in my experience, I would select that and indicate why. Then I went on to say ultimately that I didn't believe there was ever going to be, and there has never been, a silver bullet to this issue of why there are these certain entrenched problems that people with high functioning autism face in the world, and that why therefore the idea that we're sort of there's a constant march of onwards of history into progress, and then eventually we get to paradise on earth, why I thought that was incredibly naive. And so therefore I would say that because I believe in my personal experience, I can't speak for others, but my personal experience, because I found autism to be a lamentable and tragic condition, I then looked at why I believe that Protestant churches in particular ought to bring back the practice of lament, which Roman Catholic churches have always had and focused on, but Protestant churches have very sadly and bizarrely neglected and sidelined, and only really look at on Good Friday when they look at Jesus' quotation of Psalm 22 on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So then I sort of looked at, how and why has the church neglected the practice of lament, and why it should bring it back, and how it can be helpful. So that was that. So now back to the sort of provocative title. I think so. This was a quotation. This is the first fragment of the title, as it were, where it says "the trouble with being born." This is a quotation from a 20th century Romanian philosopher called Emil Cioran, and he wrote a book called this. And it's a set of quite depressing aphorisms. It's something great to read if you've got insomnia at 3 a.m. And it's sort of depressingly tragic, but also very amusing take on life. A little bit like the Peep Show. And anyway, within it, he says that there's a trouble with being born, and that we do not rush towards death. We instead flee from the catastrophe of birth. Which, yeah, if you don't have autism, may seem very strange. And when I first read it, I was a little bit taken aback. But I started to see what he meant, because he was saying that there's a sort of a deep-rooted philosophical problem with the fact that you have been born and you weren't consulted about it, that your parents had the audacity to give birth to you without even asking you when, where, how, to whom, how you'd be brought up, which genetic things you'd inherit, etc. And lots of philosophers, as I'm sure Emma would tell you, have looked at this, including particularly Hegel. Anyway, so I then looked at, so that was the sort of atheistic side from a guy called Emil Cioran. I then looked at, are there slightly less depressing but also truly honest takes on this within the Christian tradition, which could have a form of long-term hope, but not naive and silly hope. So I looked at a man called Stanley Hauerwas, who's a very famous disability theologian in America, and he wrote a book called Hannah's Child, which is obviously talking about 1 Samuel 2. But we won't get into the context because it's not really relevant here. But anyway, within the book, he said that the biggest challenge of his life was the fact that he had to live into a story that he didn't choose, and that meant that he had to positively make meaning out of the unchosen and the inconvenient. And that was the whole predication of his life. And that he had to identify with a story that had already been handed to him at birth by others, and then live into that story subsequently. And that living into process inevitably included deep growing pains. So, as I've said, if you think about it, we have no say over if we are born, when we are born, where we are born, which generation we're born into, who our parents are, the context of upbringing, etc. And yet, our modern Western liberal consumerist society idolizes choice as an objective fact. There's lots of studies into it. It emphasizes choice, autonomy, independence, rugged individualism, and freedom for nothing more than its own sake. And that's not a freedom for, but a freedom from. So freedom from oppression, freedom from all these. It's not freedom to pursue something, it's just freedom for its own sake. It's a shallow or weak form of freedom. Anyway, what does all this have to do with autism? So autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition which typically tends to start to develop at the age of 1.5 years, but is often identified much later. In my case, when I was about 20 years old, But my mum later told me that she probably noticed when I was 16, but didn't want to tell me. But that's a different story. It can be identified by its social impairments, communicational difficulties, and deficiencies in emotional intelligence, amongst many, many, many other things. It can also affect things such as taste, sensitivity to touch, light, sound, all these kind of things. And yeah, if you look on the National Autistic Society website, there's like millions of different symptoms and studies that into things you wouldn't even think would be caused by it. But anyway, so my issue was that the mainstream media, I don't like using that term, but shorthand, advertising and even academia, and even academic psychologists have overwhelmingly throughout history focused on severe autism or level 3 autism, or sort of low functioning or non-verbal, etc., where there are speech and movement impediments, and they've overwhelmingly focused on male children with low functioning autism. And that is still very much the case today. And so, even within sort of disability theology, there's very little being written directly about autism, even less about autism in adults, and even less about autism in men, and even less about high functioning autism in adult men. And so, I really wanted to zoom in there and see what I could find. And so, from a lot of the media coverage, you almost sort of think that once someone turns 18, they suddenly lose their autism and sort of like shed a layer of skin off themselves. Anyway, so I thought I'd try and address the balance here. Briefly, that I think it's fair to say that there are both pros and cons to having autism. Some of the pros are harder to pin down, whereas the cons or the deficiencies are very easy. Like you can't understand emotional intelligence even if you're taught it, which you can't be taught it anyway. These kind of things, and that you're sort of naturally hamstrung in those areas of social intelligence, etc. Recognition of body language. You get the picture. I think there are some advantages. Often people with autism tend to be more likely to be academics and tend to achieve better in those fields, tend to be very determined, driven, focused. But sometimes they have rather impractical, narrow and intransigent interests, as I do on certain things. For example, I'm rather obsessed with celibacy and the Desert Fathers, which you can't really have a great conversation with someone about at Chad's lunch. But anyway, although there are advantages and disadvantages to having autism, my argument, and I very, very, very firmly believe this, even though I can't say it's true for everyone else, is that because of the nature of the world that we live in, and because 99.5% of all people in the world do not have autism, what that means is that the advantages of having autism, limited as they are and difficult to pinpoint as they are far outweighed by the disadvantages. And that is vastly at odds with the vast majority of disability rights campaign groups, but I firmly believe it. Anyway, there is an odd saying that once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And I find that to be very true, because when you're trying to find friends as an individual with autism, sometimes it can be easier to find another friend with autism, but then you find out that they have the audacity not to share the same interests as you. And so there can't be as deep a shared world there. But I think you can draw some broad generalizations as to symptoms. So I think there's, in terms of the positive ones, I think there's a sort of determined, focused work ethic. There's perfectionism, motivation, reflectivity, deep thought, dedication, lateral thinking, abstract thought, etc. But again, deficiencies, and this is a main one for me anyway, are very narrow, restrictive, arcane, focused obsessional interests, repetitive behaviours such as stimming and rocking back on chairs, difficulty with small talk, emotional intelligence, higher sensitivity to light sound, immense difficulty in forming lasting, deep relationships and developing them further, etc. Now, these are deep problems, and to emphasise that, there's a study in the UK that found that only 5% of people with an autism diagnosis had ever been married, and that's in 2018. So despite the supposed progress of autism rights campaigners and disability rights groups, hardly any progress has ever been made. And so to me, that shows you that there are inherent mental barriers there that they just will not go away. And that's why I think autism, therefore, even high-functioning autism, in the world that we live in, because it is so social and neurotypical, is a lamentable condition. It's not a fashionable thing to say, but I think it's one of those bizarre things where our modern culture says that if you don't have a condition, you can't criticise a condition. But as I have the condition, I can criticize it and say that I'm a stupid person. But anyway, to demonstrate this point, people with autism are 4 times more likely to be lonely and experience socialization than others. They're also up to 8 times as likely to commit suicide and also much more likely to attempt to commit suicide. Now, to highlight some of the social difficulties, I thought I'd just show you a very short clip from the Michelin web show. It should be only about a minute long to show. So I will share my screen if I am technically literate. There we go. Oh, sorry, I'll do that again because I haven't got the microphone. Oops. No. Sorry, one last time. Microphone on. Okay, you'll have to tell me if the sound works for this. If it doesn't, I will try it again. But anyway. Can everyone hear that?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I haven't said anything for 15 minutes. I've been sitting here listening to your conversation, which I found to be repetitious in style and trivial in content. And I can't help thinking we'd all have a much more interesting time if I did more of the talking.
Okay, Dylan, what would you like to talk about?
Well, this is the point. I can't think of anything. But I do know that if one can't think of anything interesting to say, it's better not to say anything.
Well, I suppose that's fair enough in a way.
Yes, it is fair enough in a way. So if you don't mind, we'll all just keep quiet until I can think of something. I just can't think of anything!
He never used to go out there. He's going to come with very... Well, I don't know, he's great when he's saying well. I don't think there's any way they can not make ashes.
What are you all talking about? Everyone else seems to have someone to talk to except for me. I can't decide which conversation to join in with, so I have to sit here feeling lonely and embarrassed.
Well, we were talking about...
Yes, Richard, you and Mark were talking about the test series, in which, as you know, I have zero interest. I still don't understand the rules of cricket, and being made to play it at school was a matter of routine humiliation. I think in talking about it now, you're just trying to hurt me.
Obviously, a little bit of a caricature and a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and it wasn't necessarily based on someone with autism, but I thought it was showed the point in a hyperbolic way anyway. So that's kind of what I looked at, and I think the main point I took away was that Protestant churches have done a huge disservice to their members with autism by, first of all, not encouraging them to lament individually, but also by neglecting the communal practice of lament in the liturgy, the words of worship that the church declares together. In churches that I've been in, whenever I've said something negative about my autism, people have said, "Oh, you shouldn't think that, it's superb," and everything else. And I've said, well, I'm not sure you have the personal experience of that. And they'd say, well, I've heard from the newspaper that it's brilliant. And so I found that quite difficult. And then on top of that, there's also a thing of other people can't even attempt to share in your pain through the communal practice of lament, which was very common in ancient Israeli and Hebrew times in the Psalms. In fact, a third of all Psalms are Psalms of lament, which I find fascinating. And the book of Job is 42 chapters, and it's incredibly bitter. Like Choran, who I mentioned earlier, Job wishes that the day he was born upon would be cursed and that dark clouds would surround it and seize it. He also says that he wishes he hadn't been born and that God would kill him. But he will not do it himself because he believes that God is sovereign and rules over him. I find this very interesting because in the example of the book of Job, there's not even any discrete hints of hope, really. All mentions of hope are negative. Whenever he mentions hope, he says that God has uprooted and destroyed his hope. But equally, in the Psalms of Lament, the hope is clearer because there is petition towards the end stages, where God is asked for God is asked to intervene because it seems like he's not helping at the moment, but he has in the past, and he's also praised because of his previous interventions. And so anyway, I think I've gone a little bit over, but yeah, so I basically just wanted to say that we need to bring back lament in Protestant churches in particular. Roman Catholics are very good at it, but unfortunately I'm not a Roman Catholic. And we need to bring it back in particular in relation to high-functioning autism, because we live in a world that has the audacity to not have autism as a whole. Anyway, I hope that was slightly interesting.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. Questions, anybody? Hannah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I was just wondering, so I am a Roman Catholic, so very familiar with the amount of lamenting that we like to do. And I was wondering, sort of in the way you were talking, I thought it was very interesting. You were saying lament is almost like a solution to the experience of having sort of high-functioning autism in a world that's not really built for it.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I think, two things. The first was sort of, is this in the context of sort of a finding meaning through suffering, which is a very, I think, like from this Catholic perspective, a very, like kind of the point of lament almost is that you think of suffering as redemptive, and therefore being able to recognize something as suffering is able to transform it. And then secondly, I was wondering, it's very interesting to hear you speak on this because I know lots of other people with autism who have very different perspectives, and would take more of the track of this is, you know, sort of my particular gift, and it is a good thing. And so I was wondering, is your sort of sense of like lament as an individual or a communal thing? So would you suggest, you know, it's almost uncomfortable to think about suggesting lament as a solution writ large for people who maybe are more comfortable with their autism or don't see it as a negative thing. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, fascinating questions. I could probably write another dissertation just on a few of those, but in brief, I'm not a supporter of redemptive suffering unless it occurs directly in the context of the persecutions of Christians for their own beliefs. So I think often I think the Roman Catholic Church has made a mistake, or rather some individuals within it have made a mistake in certain encyclicals when they've said that suffering itself has or should have redemptive value, even when it's not in the context of persecution for faith. So if you look at all of the examples in all of the Pauline epistles that are pulled out, like Romans 5, you know, suffering's brilliant because it gives us these gifts of endurance and all the rest of it, they don't justify the suffering occurring in the first place, but they are positive byproducts that can come out of the suffering because it has occurred in a broken world. So that's the first thing I'd say. So I don't lament because I value suffering per se. I lament because it's an inevitable thing for me, because there are sufferings that are caused from the deficiencies of my autism. So I find it hard to understand body language and emotions and facial expressions, whatever. So that can lead to misunderstandings and people perceiving me as being rude sometimes, etc. So that causes me a suffering. So I lament because I'm a human being. Like I couldn't not lament because it's a bad thing. Like why would I rejoice in that? I guess is my question. So in my argument is that naturally, often we don't recognize when we lament, but naturally when we do lament, it's strange to try and sort of like repress it. Because it's a natural thing. A bit like if someone punches you, like it'd be a bit weird if you then thought, okay, I'll go paintballing. It just seems a strange thing to respond. So that's one thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is I didn't manage to talk about lament very much because of the limitation of the time. But I think there's two main roles that lament plays, particularly in this area. First of all, I think it's a forerunner to praise, which I think you see particularly in the lament songs, but you don't see in Job. Why that is, I don't know, but you'd have to ask my supervisor, Dr. Volpe. But anyway, I think it serves as a good forerunner to praise, because when you're in the immediate midst of suffering, so when someone stabbed you, you're not going to praise God. But a month later, when the wound is healing, you might do. And so what do you do in that time? Do you despair and entirely give up on your belief in God? No, I don't think you do, and I don't think you should either. Or do you say, why are you doing this? Why, oh why? How long do I have to wait? Why are you not intervening? Do you do that instead? Is that a more helpful way of not repressing, but of making positive meaning, realistic, honest, authentic, positive meaning out of the suffering that you inevitably and unavoidably face that you would rather not face. So there's that, and then the second main purpose of lament in this context is, as I've just said, it's the backstop to despair. It's the only thing that can prevent you from despairing altogether and giving up on your faith altogether and giving up on the possibility of objective long-term meaning altogether. And then just finally on the other point, yes, so I think I tried to say at the beginning, this is my own personal experience. I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of other adult men with high-functioning autism in the world feel the same. I think a lot of them don't want to say that because they'll be seen as like they have an internalized disability phobia or whatever term the postmodernists want to put on it. But I think it is true that a lot of people feel like that. It's not for me to say most of them do, or a plurality of them do, or a majority of them do, but I think probably they do, and they just don't speak out about it because the activists on a disability front are out of line with each individual person with the disability. However, I have no doubt there are some people who in certain contexts or environments have had an overall net positive experience from autism. They still have some deficiencies, but they're not outweighed in the same way. So I think, yeah, for the focus in the short term is to recover lament on an individual level, but also I think even just forgetting about the whole disability dimension of the context of lament, it's very useful, and it is part of the liturgy, whether or not we choose to include it. It's part of the liturgy, so it's a strange thing. It's particularly in like evangelical Protestant churches, they don't ever talk about it. It's like, well, I thought you were Bible believers. Anyway, there you are. My thoughts.
No, that's super interesting. I had never thought about like lament as sort of an honest expression of faith.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes you can feel guilty if you're,
Sure.
In the moment of suffering and you're lamenting it. It begins to feel like despair.
Yes.
The idea of it as a backstop against despair is actually fascinating. So thank you.
Just to, in one quick sentence, just to respond to that, I think I found that to be very true because it's a device which enables us to speak our confusion to God, even when we think we're getting the answer phone in response and the answering machine rather in response. It's a way to speak our confusion to God and say we dare to not disbelieve, but we dare to question and we dare to have the courage to doubt. Yeah.
Any more questions for Ben? If no one else has one, I have one, Ben, if I may.
Sure.
I mean, the thrust of much of the kind of disability activism has been to see people not as disabled, but differently abled, and to rejoice in the positives of their different ability. To what extent do you think your position might be true in relation to other disabilities?
Okay.
Not just autism, but perhaps to physical disabilities and such like. Do you think people are... I mean, I wonder sometimes whether people are kind of under quite an amount of peer pressure to kind of rejoice in their difference when actually what they want to do is lament.
That's a really interesting question. I think there's a couple of main things I'd sort of say in response. I think one thing is, so I think I talked about how our society has idolized, particularly sort of, not necessarily atheistic, but certainly secular modern Western Europe has idolized choice. But it's choice per se, choice for nothing other than itself. I think that's a huge problem because if there's no end in sight, what's the purpose of the choice? It becomes very nihilistic and without meaning. And I think it's the same with diversity. I think we've idolized diversity. So people say, oh, it's good that there's multiple sexualities. Well, I think that fact in itself, I don't see why is diversity itself a good thing per se. I don't understand that. In fact, it can often be an inconvenience because it means that people experience prejudice and oppression and etc. And so I think that's the case with, if you look at something like neurodiversity, I think it's a similar thing. So I would say myself, I haven't done research on, I only did it on high functioning autism, which is quite narrow, but I would say myself, some of the points I'm saying would probably also apply to ADHD, for example, and other conditions which cause social impairments, maybe personality disorders, that kind of thing. Physical disabilities, I'm not sure, but I think in some ways, although I think they're probably overall worse in terms of pain and difficulty, etc., they're simpler because if I'm walking down the street, I don't know who has autism and who doesn't have autism. If I'm walking down the street, I can see someone in a wheelchair okay, you're probably physically disabled, unless you've lied and you've somehow got a wheelchair anyway. So it's something where you can see, like sometimes I wish that I could have a massive sticker on my head saying I have autism and I can't understand social emotions, but because it is obvious, right? Whereas when you don't have that, people don't understand. Oh, why is he seeming rude? Why does it? So sorry, it's a very sort of very much a tangent there, but I think it's a difference between the mental and the physical disability side of things. And I think that in some ways, mental people have it harder. People who are mentally disabled or socially impaired or whatever have it harder because, first of all, they're very much in the minority, but second of all, people don't know they have the condition. And third of all, like, okay, at the start of this year in my house, I said to everyone, we have a group chat, I said to everyone, by the way, I've got autism, which means I have difficulties with da 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 da. It's not an excuse, but it just means I'm going to be rubbish at this, and this. But still, people haven't really understood that. And they don't really want to ask questions, but they just haven't really understood it. And so I say that the sort of entrenched challenges are worse there. So it's easier to say that you should lament if you have a mental disability than if you have a physical one, in my view. But I have to do more research.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And if I can thank all of our speakers, Abby and Emma, James, Kira and Ben, for some fascinating presentations. Thank you very much indeed. I think everybody should have a round of applause. And I don't know whether you want to say a few closing words, Dr. Maston?
Yes,